Most people don't struggle because they lack intelligence or effort. They struggle because no one ever explained the rules that quietly govern human behavior. If you've ever felt overlooked despite doing things right, misunderstood while trying to be reasonable, or drained from playing fair in situations that weren't designed to be fair, this channel is for you. Unspoken Laws doesn't teach manipulation. It reveals the dynamics already shaping outcomes, whether you see them or not. Here, we replace confusion with clarity, not to make you harder, but to help you move through the world without losing yourself. Let's begin. There's a quiet tension that runs beneath this topic, and many people sense it without having words for it. You notice that kindness, when offered consistently, doesn't always earn respect. Sometimes it does the opposite. People listen less carefully. Requests are brushed aside. Your presence feels lighter than it should. This isn't because kindness is weak, and it isn't because you've done something wrong. What's rarely said is that human systems don't respond to intention. They respond to signals. And kindness, when uncontained, can accidentally send a signal you never meant to transmit. Many kind people assume that being reasonable will naturally be recognized, that fairness will be noticed, that patience will speak for itself. Quietly, without announcement, they keep showing up with empathy, flexibility, and understanding, even when others don't return it. Over time, something subtle happens. The environment adjusts around them, not in a cruel way, not consciously, but predictably. When someone consistently absorbs friction, smooths conflict, and makes themselves easy to deal with, the system begins to rely on that. Expectations shift. The person becomes the stabilizer, not the decision maker, the buffer, not the authority. This isn't about being taken advantage of in dramatic ways. It's much quieter than that. It's being interrupted more often. It's having your no questioned. It's being asked to bend just this once, again and again, because you usually do. And because you're kind, you often assume the issue is communication. Maybe you weren't clear enough. Maybe you need to explain your reasoning better. Maybe if they understood your intentions, things would change. But intention is invisible. What people respond to is consistency, containment, and the subtle cues that signal where your limits actually are. Kind people are often deeply self-aware. They reflect, they adjust, they consider others, but they're rarely taught how authority actually forms in everyday interactions, not dominance, not force. Authority as a quiet, stable presence that doesn't over-explain itself. So when kindness is offered without clear boundaries, it can be misread as availability. When understanding is endless, it can be mistaken for agreement. When patience never runs out, it can feel like it doesn't need to be respected. This isn't about becoming colder, and it isn't about withdrawing your humanity. It's about understanding why the world sometimes responds to you in ways that don't match who you are. Once that becomes visible, the confusion begins to loosen. What complicates this further is that kind people often confuse seriousness with intensity. They assume that if they remain calm, reasonable, and emotionally even, others will sense the weight of what they're saying. But seriousness, in social systems, isn't registered through tone alone. It's registered through consequence. Most people don't consciously test boundaries. They lean on what has already proven flexible. When nothing pushes back, the system quietly categorizes that person as safe to disregard again, not maliciously, but functionally. This is where many kind people feel an internal split. They notice that when they finally speak up, the response feels delayed or muted. Their words land softer than expected. Sometimes they're met with surprise, as if the other person didn't realize this mattered to them at all. And in a way, the system didn't. Because seriousness isn't measured by how thoughtful your explanation is. It's measured by what changes when a line is crossed. People don't listen more because you're right. They listen because something becomes different if they don't. This is uncomfortable to hear for people who value fairness and goodwill. It can feel cynical, even disappointing. But this isn't about morality. It's about pattern recognition. When your kindness is constant and your boundaries are negotiable, others don't experience contrast. There's no signal that distinguishes what's acceptable from what isn't. Everything blends into the same tone of accommodation. So when you finally express discomfort, it feels new to you, but not urgent to them. They've learned over time, that things usually work out anyway. This is why explaining yourself more rarely fixes the issue. More context doesn't create gravity. More reasoning doesn't establish weight. It can even do the opposite, reinforcing the idea that you're still trying to earn understanding rather than standing inside a settled position. Quietly, without announcement, seriousness forms when your behavior becomes predictable around your limits, when your presence carries a kind of density, when people know not intellectually, but intuitively, that certain lines don't dissolve with discussion. Kind people often delay this because they don't want to seem rigid. They fear being misread as unempathetic. So they keep absorbing small discomforts, telling themselves it's not worth making a fuss. But the cost accumulates internally. Resentment doesn't come from being kind. It comes from being uncontained. And when that resentment eventually surfaces, it feels out of character, even to you. You wonder why you're suddenly tired, why your patience feels thinner, why you don't recognize your own reactions. This isn't a personal failure, it's a structural one. You were never taught that respect doesn't grow out of niceness. It grows out of coherence, when what you allow, what you tolerate, and what you value quietly align. Once that alignment is missing, seriousness can't register, even when your intentions are pure. And this is where the real shift begins. Not in becoming louder, but in becoming clearer. There's an unspoken belief many kind people carry, often without realizing it, that if they remain patient long enough, others will eventually notice. That consistency in goodwill will, at some point, be met with reciprocity. That being reasonable creates a kind of moral gravity. But social systems don't operate on moral accounting. They operate on adaptation. People adjust to the behavior they experience most. And when your default state is understanding, flexibility, and forgiveness, others calibrate themselves around that. Not because they disrespect you as a person, but because the environment has taught them there's no immediate cost to pushing a little further. This is why seriousness often feels invisible when it's finally expressed. You feel the weight of it because it's been building internally for a long time, but externally, there's been no signal marking that build-up, no shift in pattern, no change in consequence. So your words arrive without context. And this can be deeply disorienting. You start questioning your delivery, your tone, your timing. You replay conversations in your mind, wondering how something so obvious to you could feel so small to others. What's rarely acknowledged is that seriousness isn't something you declare. It's something others infer from how stable your limits are over time. Kind people are often fluid. They adjust to moods, circumstances, and pressures. They pride themselves on being adaptable. But adaptability, when it becomes habitual, can erode clarity. Not clarity in your own mind, but clarity in how others experience you. When people can't predict where you'll hold and where you'll bend, they assume bending is always an option. This doesn't mean you need to become rigid. It means the system needs something solid to orient around. There's a quiet difference between being open and being permeable. Openness allows connection. Permeability allows erosion. And many kind people live in that second state without realizing it, slowly thinning themselves out to maintain harmony. Over time, this creates a strange paradox. You're trusted emotionally, but not deferred to. People come to you for understanding, but not for decisions. You become the place where tension is released, not where direction is set. That's why being taken seriously can feel elusive. It's not that people don't value you, it's that they've placed you in a role that doesn't carry weight. And roles, once assigned, are remarkably stable. Changing that isn't about confrontation. It isn't about asserting dominance. It begins with noticing where you consistently override your own signals to preserve comfort, yours or theirs. Not to judge yourself, but to see the pattern clearly. Because until you see it, you'll keep mistaking exhaustion for effort and misunderstanding for bad luck, when what's actually missing is containment. And containment, unlike kindness, doesn't announce itself. Containment is one of those concepts that feels abstract until you notice its absence. It isn't something you add, it's something that becomes visible when it's missing. Kind people often live without it, not because they reject it, but because no one ever showed them what it looks like in practice. Containment doesn't mean shutting people out. It means your inner decisions don't leak outward in real time. It means others don't get access to every doubt, every internal negotiation, every moment of hesitation. When your inner process is exposed, people unconsciously treat your position as unfinished, and unfinished things invite interference. Many kind people think transparency builds trust. In some contexts, it does. But in ongoing social systems, workplaces, families, long-term relationships, constant transparency can dissolve authority. When people hear you weigh options out loud, reconsider boundaries in the moment, or soften your stance to keep peace, they register uncertainty, even if you're deeply thoughtful. So when you later need to be taken seriously, the signal is inconsistent with the pattern they've learned. This is why seriousness often requires restraint, not emotional withdrawal, but internal closure, a sense that what you're saying isn't still being negotiated inside you. Kind people are often still deciding as they speak. They leave space for others to influence the outcome because they value inclusion. But inclusion without a center doesn't create collaboration. It creates drift, and drift erodes respect quietly. People don't follow what feels unresolved. They lean into what feels settled. This doesn't mean you must always be certain. It means others don't need to witness the uncertainty phase. They only need to encounter the result. When you consistently present conclusions instead of process, the system begins to recalibrate. Conversations change shape, interruptions decrease, requests come with more care. Not because you demanded it, but because your presence now carries a boundary without having to state one. Kindness paired with containment feels different. It feels grounded. It feels intentional. It signals that your generosity is a choice, not a reflex. Without that distinction, kindness becomes predictable, and predictability, when unprotected, becomes something others plan around. This is where many people feel resistance. They worry this sounds inauthentic, like hiding, like withholding. But containment isn't deception, it's discernment. It's choosing where your inner world is accessible and where it isn't. You're not obligated to make your internal labor visible for it to be real. When you begin to contain yourself, something subtle shifts. You speak a little less. You explain a little less. You don't rush to fill silence or smooth discomfort. And in that space, others begin to adjust their behavior without being told to. Seriousness starts to register, not because you've changed who you are, but because you've stopped leaking who you are before it's formed. And that quiet shift lays the groundwork for something deeper. What often surprises people at this stage is how little effort the shift actually requires. There's no dramatic boundary-setting moment, no speech, no confrontation. The change happens mostly in what you stop doing. You stop preemptively softening your position. You stop offering emotional cushioning before it's been asked for. You stop rescuing others from the discomfort of your clarity. And because this is unfamiliar, it can feel unsettling at first. Silence feels heavier. Pauses feel longer. You may worry that you're being misinterpreted, or that you're creating distance where there used to be ease. But what's actually happening is that the system is recalibrating. When you no longer rush to smooth things over, others are forced to locate themselves. They feel the edges of your presence. Not sharply, not aggressively, just clearly enough to know where you end and they begin. Kind people often underestimate how much they've been doing this invisible work for others, translating, softening, absorbing tension so no one else has to feel it. And when that labor quietly stops, it's noticeable, not because you've become cold, but because the room now has shape. This is where seriousness begins to take root, not as a performance, but as a byproduct of stability. People start listening differently. They wait a beat longer before pushing. They phrase things more carefully. Sometimes they don't even know why. They just feel that something is more solid. And this solidity doesn't come from asserting yourself more often. It comes from asserting yourself less, but meaning it when you do. There's a deep misconception that being taken seriously requires constant reinforcement, repeating boundaries, reminding people, correcting behavior in real time. For kind people, this usually backfires because it keeps the boundary in a state of negotiation. What carries weight is not repetition, it's follow-through. Not punishment, not escalation, just quiet consistency. When your actions align with your words without explanation, the system learns quickly, much faster than when you try to reason it into understanding. This is where self-respect becomes visible, not as pride, but as coherence. You don't need others to agree with you. You don't need them to understand your inner logic. You only need your behavior to match your internal decisions. And once that alignment is there, seriousness no longer needs to be asked for. It's felt. Kind people often fear that this will cost them connection, but what it actually costs is confusion. Relationships become clearer, expectations become more realistic. Some dynamics may fall away, yes, but often because they were built on access you never meant to give. What remains is quieter, fewer misunderstandings, less resentment, less internal negotiation. And in that quiet, something important settles. You begin to feel less drained, not because you're doing less for others, but because you're no longer erasing yourself in the process. That's when kindness stops working against you. At this point, many people notice a subtle emotional response rising up, a kind of grief, not dramatic, but real. It's the realization of how long you've been compensating for environments that never asked you to, and how normal that felt. When you stop over-functioning, you begin to see how much effort was quietly propping things up. This can feel destabilizing at first. You may notice moments where you would normally step in, clarify, reassure, smooth, explain, and you don't. You let the moment stand as it is. And in that pause, there's often an impulse to go back to the old pattern, simply because it's familiar. Familiarity can masquerade as kindness. What's rarely acknowledged is that many kind people were rewarded early in life for being easy to be around, for not needing much, for understanding others before being understood themselves. Over time, that identity solidifies. Being agreeable becomes a way of staying connected. Being flexible becomes a way of staying safe. So when you begin to change the pattern, there can be an underlying fear that something essential will be lost. But what's actually being lost is not connection, it's overexposure. When your inner world is no longer fully accessible, people have to meet you where you are, instead of leaning into you for regulation. This shifts the emotional geometry of relationships. The weight redistributes. Some people respond well to this. They adapt. They respect the new shape. Others feel unsettled, even irritated, without being able to explain why. They may interpret your calm restraint as distance or disapproval. This is one of the quiet tests of self-respect. Not whether you can hold a boundary when it's praised, but whether you can hold it when it's misunderstood. Kind people often rush to repair that misunderstanding, to reassure others that nothing is wrong, that they're still good, still open, still accommodating. But seriousness doesn't survive constant reassurance. When you let others sit with their interpretations instead of correcting them, something important happens. You stop managing how you're perceived, and perception begins to recalibrate on its own. This isn't about becoming indifferent. It's about allowing others to do their share of the emotional work, to tolerate ambiguity, to feel their own discomfort without handing it back to you. As this stabilizes, you may notice your energy returning in small ways. Conversations feel shorter but more grounded. Decisions feel cleaner. You're less pulled into explaining yourself into exhaustion. And perhaps most importantly, your sense of self feels less scattered. Being taken seriously isn't about commanding attention. It's about no longer dispersing yourself in every interaction. When your presence is gathered, instead of spread thin, people feel it, even if they can't name it. This is the quiet return of authority, not imposed, not demanded, but emerging naturally from containment. And once it's there, it changes how you move through the world. As this way of moving settles in, another layer becomes visible. You start to notice how often seriousness was confused with emotional display, how intensity, urgency, or even frustration were treated as proof that something mattered. Kind people tend to do the opposite. They stay regulated. They keep their tone even. They don't dramatize. And because of that, the emotional volume others rely on as a cue never appears. So the system misreads the signal. This isn't because people are shallow. It's because most environments are conditioned to respond to disruption. Calm is often interpreted as capacity. Silence is interpreted as agreement. Emotional steadiness is mistaken for unlimited tolerance. What's rarely said is that seriousness doesn't require emotional escalation. It requires decisional finality. When your words sound open-ended, even if your feelings are not, others assume there's room to push. When your tone stays gentle but your stance is firm, people eventually learn that gentleness doesn't equal negotiability. This takes time. And during that time, There may be moments that feel awkward. You may notice others testing the edges again, not out of malice, but habit. Old patterns look for familiar responses. The difference now is that you don't rush to meet them there. You let the pause exist. You let your earlier words stand without reinforcement. You don't add justification or soften the landing. And in doing so, you give the system something new to register: stability. Kind people often underestimate how powerful stability is. Not emotional intensity, not persuasion, stability. The quiet sense that what you've said will still be true tomorrow. Once others feel that, they begin to orient differently. They adjust their expectations preemptively. They approach with more care, not because they fear you, but because they sense you won't move just to keep things smooth. This is where respect becomes embodied, not conceptual. You don't need to insist on being taken seriously. In fact, insisting often undermines it. Seriousness emerges when there's no visible effort to enforce it, when your presence alone carries a settled quality. This doesn't make you less kind. It makes your kindness more deliberate. When generosity is chosen rather than automatic, it feels different to receive. It carries weight. People recognize it as something that could be withdrawn, not as a threat, but as a reality. And that recognition changes the dynamic. You're no longer the person who will always absorb the impact. You're the person whose boundaries quietly redistribute responsibility. Others begin to bring more thought into their requests, more respect into their assumptions. Not because you asked for it, because the system finally learned how to read you. There's a quiet relief that often follows this recognition. Not excitement, not triumph, just a sense of things settling into their proper places. You begin to realize that being taken seriously was never about proving your worth. It was about no longer obscuring it. Kind people often live as if their value needs to be demonstrated continuously, through effort, through understanding, through patience. They give more context, more access, more flexibility, believing that clarity will eventually emerge from generosity. But clarity doesn't emerge from more giving. It emerges from alignment. When your internal decisions, your external behavior, and your tolerance thresholds finally match, the signal becomes clean. Others don't have to guess anymore. They don't have to test. They don't have to push to find the edge, because the edge is already perceptible. This is where a deeper calm appears. You stop scanning interactions for signs of disrespect, not because disrespect no longer exists, but because it no longer destabilizes you. You trust your own containment enough to respond or not respond without urgency. And that lack of urgency is often what people read as seriousness. Urgency leaks need. Calm suggests sufficiency. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means your care is no longer reactive. You don't rush to fix misunderstandings. You don't chase alignment. You allow relationships to show you what they are capable of holding. Some rise to meet you, some don't. And this is where another unspoken law becomes clear. Not all distance is loss. Some distance is information. Kind people often interpret distance as failure, as something to repair. But sometimes distance is simply what appears when overextension ends. When you stop reaching past your natural limits, the space that opens up reveals which connections were sustained by effort alone. This can feel sobering, even disappointing, but it's also clarifying, because the connections that remain don't require you to shrink, soften, or explain yourself into coherence. They respond to your steadiness. They respect your pace. They don't demand constant access to your inner world. In those spaces, your kindness feels lighter, freer, less costly. Being taken seriously, in the end, isn't about changing how others see you. It's about changing how available you are to be misread. When you stop offering unlimited access, unlimited patience, unlimited flexibility, people begin to encounter you more accurately. Not as a resource to lean on endlessly, but as a person with shape, weight, and presence. And that presence doesn't need defending. It holds itself. What all of this points to, gently but clearly, is that there was never anything wrong with your kindness. You were not naive. You were not weak. You were not missing something essential. You were operating with incomplete information. You were taught explicitly or implicitly that goodness would be recognized on its own, that reasonableness would be met with reason, that if you stayed fair, things would balance out. And sometimes they do, but often they don't. Not because people are bad, but because systems respond to structure, not sentiment. Understanding this doesn't require you to become guarded or suspicious. It simply invites you to become more whole. When kindness is paired with self-respect, it stops leaking outward. It stops being something others unconsciously lean on. It becomes something you offer deliberately, from a centered place. And when that happens, it carries a different tone, a quieter authority. You don't need to announce your limits for them to exist. You don't need to harden to be respected. You don't need to withdraw your empathy to be taken seriously. What changes is internal. You begin deciding before you speak. You allow pauses without filling them. You let your actions close the loop instead of your explanations. And over time, the world adjusts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. Conversations slow down, requests become more thoughtful, expectations recalibrate. You feel less pressure to perform your goodness and more freedom to inhabit it. Most importantly, the exhaustion eases, because exhaustion was never caused by caring. It was caused by caring without containment, by giving without clear edges, by absorbing what was never yours to carry. Once you see this, you can't unsee it, but you also don't need to do anything forceful with it. Awareness alone begins to shift how you show up. You move a little slower. You speak a little less. You trust your internal clarity more than external approval. And in that quieter posture, seriousness emerges naturally, not as a demand, but as a felt presence. You are still kind. You are still thoughtful. You are still fair. You're just no longer disappearing inside those qualities. That's not a loss of warmth. It's the return of balance. And from that balance, you move through the world with less confusion, less drain, and far more dignity, without ever needing to explain yourself.